This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
And for this time, we are given some very clear signs in the Bible concerning the end of the church, which will usher in what Joel calls the great and awesome day of the Lord, which is the title, basically, for the end times, and we identify it also as Great Tribulation, leading up to the judgment of God. So it's that period of time that starts after the church age ends. So these 3 chapters in Revelation that we're going to be looking at over the next several weeks tell us about what's going on right now and how we're to respond, what we're supposed to do and how we're to respond to what's going on in the world today. And how we're to it's a time of discovery, and it's also a time of direction. So we're going to look over the next several weeks at what God is doing in the church today and what He expects out of the church, what He wants the church to do, because that ushers in the close of the church age and then this next great and this great and awesome day of the Lord, which will usher in at the close of the church age. Well, you might ask though, now wait a minute. Didn't Jesus say in Mark 13:22 or 32 that concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven or the Son, but only the Father? Be on guard, keep awake, for you don't know when the time will come. Didn't that? So are you putting dates and times there? Yes, Jesus did most certainly say that. But notice that what He said was that no one knows the exact day and hour that all of this will commence. But the signs which are given do tell us about the seasons and the times. In other words, while we may not know the exact day and time, we can know the approximate period which this will happen, and it's revealed to us by numerous signs and wonders. So Jesus said, watch for the signs. You're not going to know the exact day and hour that it's all going to happen, but watch for the signs, because that'll give you a clue that we're in the season, that we're in the time. And so just as those seasons and times were identified in the history of God's Word, in the Old Testament, and then in the New Testament as they walked with Jesus, and then at the beginning of the church age, it's all there. The history is there. The seasons, the signs, all of that is there. Now those are given to us for our time, which is happening right now and identified in the first 3 chapters of Revelation. So, we may not know the exact day and time, but we can know the approximate period in which all of this is going to happen. And we need to be aware of the signs and wonders that are given to us, because prophet Joel says, that's what's going to happen. Watch for those signs and wonders. Now, there are a significant number of these signs and interesting events that are going on right now. I mean, we're all aware of some of those things that are going on and even continue to build up and will continue on beyond. But it's interesting to watch what's happening right now as things continue to build up for September of this year. Now, the reason I mention September, because September, a period of time of September is the month of Tishri for the Jewish calendar. We'll mention that a few times. But I want you to understand that please listen to what I'm saying. I am not saying that the rapture is going to happen in September this year. I believe it could happen. In fact, I believe that these signs and evidences may be given to us to warn us, advise us, focus, and connect us with something that God is up to. And to ignore these signs and wonders would be foolish and rebellious. So I believe that the rapture could happen, but it doesn't necessarily have to happen. What these signs and wonders just tell us that God is up to something, because they fit into what His Word tells us. And it also confirms that we are in this time, that God has put you and me in this time, at this point in history, at this place, for His purpose, His plan. You are called for this moment. Now, Abraham, Joseph, Noah, all those guys, they were called for their moment in the Old Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they were called for their moment, when Christ walked on earth. Then the church started, and there were all those church people in that period of time. They were called for that time, but you are called for this time. And you are called for this time that happens in those first 3 chapters of Revelation. So it's important for us to live according to what our calling is, but to be aware of the signs that confirm our calling. So what are some of those signs? What are some of those events that I'm talking about? I mentioned earlier, I appreciate Tony Lowe sharing some of his notes with me concerning these events, and I'm using some of those notes and then some things that I've added to it. But September falls around this Jewish calendar month of Tishri, and here's how it begins. This is how the whole thing begins. On the 13th of September, there will be a partial solar eclipse. That happens to be Rosh Hashanah. That's the Jewish New Year. The 13th also marks the 5th annual Jewish Feast of Trumpets. So they will have the Jewish Feast of Trumpets. There will be a number of feasts that happen, 3 feasts that happened in September. We'll be looking at those, and they all happen within 15 days. Now, it's important to understand this this solar eclipse, maybe a social eclipse too, I don't know. But it's important to understand this solar eclipse and what it means. Solar activities in the Bible are typically signs of God's judgment to all nations. Now, the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar. And so references to lunar eclipses are considered to be references of judgments on Israel. But solar eclipses are considered to be a reference to a judgment on all nations. So remember that. Lunar eclipses have something to do with Israel. Solar eclipses have something to do with all nations, or many nations. So on this September 13th is the beginning of this Rosh Hashanah and the Feast of Trumpets. On that date, on the 13th, that date is also the end of the 7th year of what's called the Shemitah. The Shemitah, which is spelled S-H-E-M-I-T-A-H. You'd think you'd pronounce it differently, but that's how it's pronounced, Shemitah. The Shemitah is a financial and environmental cycle which God set up. And it actually traces back, you can trace it all the way back to the time that Joseph was with the Pharaoh, when Joseph had been taken captive. And the dream that he interprets for the Pharaoh has to do with this Shemitah, the 7-year cycle. And God sets this financial and environmental cycle up, and in the 7th year of each Shemitah, God commanded the Jews to rest the land, forgive certain debts, and reestablish a commitment to God's ways. So this cycle of Shemitahs, which is also, by the way, related to Daniel's 77s, we'll look at that later on when we get into other parts of Revelation. But Daniel talked about a period of 77s, in other words, weeks and years of 7s, and 70 of those and that sort of thing. And that's an important number in the Bible. And that these 77s and these 70 years of judgment that are all linked, that are identified in Daniel, are a link to a judgment of Israel. Every 70th Shemitah is known as a Super Shemitah. We also call that the year of Jubilee. You've heard that term, year of Jubilee. That's when that happens. It's at the end of the 70th Shemitahs. In other words, 490 years. At this particular cycle of 7 years that we are seeing now, happens to be a Super Shemitah. And it will end on September the 13th. Now, the sad thing about it is that Israel no longer observes the Shemitah. Not really. I mean, there are a few people that do, but Israel as a nation doesn't really observe it anymore. But I believe that God's given principle is still in effect. So if you ignore the Shemitah, you can expect judgment from God. If you ignore the Super Shemitah, you can definitely expect judgment from God. And Israel is ignoring this Shemitah. The Shemitah was intended by God actually to be a year of blessing. That's what God wanted it for. If you do it God's way and obey God, then there would be a year of blessing. But not only for Israel, but for all peoples. This principle seems to apply for all peoples. But when it's disobeyed, it becomes a year of judgment. And there is certainly a pattern of judgments or a pattern of disciplines. Now, I'm not going to say they're judgments all the time. They could be disciplines, and there's a big difference. So there's this pattern of judgments or disciplines at 7-year intervals. For example, in America, September 2001 and 2008 were marked by the greatest crashes in Wall Street history, even worse than the Great Depression. The crash itself was worse. The results weren't quite the same. But the crash itself was the worst. It was an economic crash. Many of you lost a lot of money. My dad lost 30%, I believe, of his savings in that crash. It was a terrible crash in Wall Street, and it occurred. Obviously, it occurred a few days after 9/11. I don't think 9/11 was a judgment from God or a discipline. I think that was an attack. It was a terrorist attack. But the economic result of it was probably a discipline. It happened in 2001 and then again in 2008, and both of them in September. But here's the interesting thing about it. Both of them happened. The first one happened on September the 17th. The second one happened on September the 29th. Both of them happened in the Jewish calendar, which is different from our calendar, remember. Both of them happened on the biblical day of Elul 29. They both happened on that exact same day. The Jewish calendar, Elul 29, which was also the very day appointed to end the Shemitah. So in each one of those cases, it was the end of a Shemitah. 2001, the end of a Shemitah. 2008, end of a Shemitah. So on that day, that's coming up, September 13th, we have an end of a super Shemitah and a solar eclipse, which, remember, represents judgment to the nations. What's going to happen? I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. It may not happen that day, but it's a sign, I think, that God gives us that says, look, you need to watch. That there are certain things that I give you signs about. And if you're not going to obey me, you can expect that there will be a discipline or a judgment. What else happens in September? September the 15th, which is also Independence Day for Honduras, by the way, for those of you who are sending me gifts. September the 15th marks the first day of the 70th session of the UN General Assembly. The United Nations meets for the 70th time on September the 15th. They'll go from September the 15th through the 28th. And also during that time, September the 15th, right in the middle of that is September the 23rd, and that marks the Jewish observance of the 6th Jewish feast, which is the Day of Atonement, right in the very middle of that time. Interestingly enough, the very next day, on the 24th, September the 24th, for the first time in history, a pope, Catholic pope, will address the joint session of Congress, U.S. Congress. Never happened before. But the Pope is going to address the U.S. Congress, and he's going to speak on some things that he's also going to speak on the very next day to the United Nations. So the Pope is going to speak on the 24th to the U.S. Congress, and then on the very next day, he's going to speak to the United Nations. And you want to know what he's going to talk about? That information has been leaked and told. You know, it's kind of a media strategy. This is what he's going to be talking about: climate change, poverty, wealth redistribution, the encouragement of a single world currency, and for the first time ever, a world tax, supposedly for environmental issues. Now, I want to address the environmental issue thing here because it's important. I do believe that we are called to be good stewards of the earth. I mean, after all, one of the key responsibilities of Adam and Eve was to manage God's creation, right? And it's very easy to become very focused on environmentalism, which I think is a healthy thing, to be good stewards of the earth. But it's also easy to get so focused on that we lose sight on what it is that God wants. Romans 1, verse 25 says this, talking about those who have rebelled against God: they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Now, listen to what I'm saying. You simply cannot be a good environmentalist if your focus is on the creation and not the Creator. Listen to what I'm saying. And don't cut me off just yet. Let me explain. You cannot be a good environmentalist if your focus is on the creation and not the Creator. If your motivation is to save the planet instead of pleasing God, you've already failed. Because God says, I want you to obey me. And what that says is, if God wants us to be good stewards of what He has provided for us, which includes the earth, then we do it because we're obeying God, not because we're trying to save the planet or save the whales or all those things are noble, they're good, and if you're into them, God bless you, I'm all for that. But don't lose sight of the Creator. And the warning comes in Romans that it's dangerous to exchange this thing and get so focused on serving the created things rather than the Creator. Our focus is the Creator. And obedience to the Creator, we take care of the created. That's important to do. But don't lose focus of why we do it. Now, on the 28th of September, something really interesting happens. That date is something that's called the fourth blood moon. This is the conclusion of a tetrad of blood moons. Four blood moons, which are eclipses, lunar eclipses, in a row. These blood moons are spectacular lunar eclipses in which the moon actually appears to be red. And this fourth and final one of the tetrad will be visible in Jerusalem during Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles. It will happen on the evening of the Feast of Tabernacles, the seventh and final annual Jewish feast. And interestingly about all of that is that this one time, I don't think it's ever happened before, this one particular blood moon will also be a supermoon. Now, a supermoon it's the only time in a rather oval orbit. The moon doesn't go around the earth in an exact circle. It's more like an oval. And it will be that one point in that orbit that it is closest to the earth. And it appears to be a little larger than normal. It's not like a big spectacular, you see those pictures like there's giant moon. It's not like E.T. come home type thing. But the moon does appear a little larger because it is actually a little closer to the earth. And so it's called a supermoon for that reason. But it's the first time that has ever happened, as far as we can trace back astronomy, that this supermoon and a blood moon happens on this Feast of Tabernacles. The reason for the extreme interest in this is that every time there has been a blood moon tetrad, or 4 blood moon lunar eclipses in a row, there has always been a significant event about that time in the history of Israel. And it always seems to have something to do with the spilling of blood. What are some of the examples that have happened during a blood moon? It gives us reason to believe that something might happen. Well, in 1492, what happened? Some of you weren't in school that day, apparently. But in 1493, the very next year, there was a blood moon. And that was also the year that the first Spanish inquisitor, conquistador, Tomás de Torquemada, began slaughtering Jews in Spain, and the Jews were expelled from Spain. And by the way, where did many of them go to find safe haven? America. There was also a blood moon on the eve of Israel's Declaration of Independence in 1948, following a bloody war that took place only a few years after the Holocaust when 6 million Jews were murdered. A blood moon coincided with the Six-Day War in 1967. 2 blood moons appeared in 2014. They coincided with major events in the Middle East, a war between Israel and Hamas in the summer of 2014, and then this massive rise of ISIS, or Daesh as we also call them, an attempt to establish a new caliphate. That's what they're doing, establish this new Islamic rule in Syria and Iraq. So this ISIS just began this massive move, and now they're bigger than Al-Qaeda. And now we're getting word that ISIS has grown significantly in Gaza, as we saw in the news this morning. So it's interesting how these events seem to line up with signs and wonders given to us by God. Joel 3:3 says this, "I will set wonders in the heavens and earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun will turn to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming and great awesome day of the God." By the way, I want to point something out here. Pillars of smoke may refer to volcanic activity. Pillars of smoke rise up. So it's not like, I used to think maybe it meant like nuclear war or lightning coming down or something like that, but pillars of smoke rise. And that seems to be on the increase, although some scientists scoff at that. But I want to read you an article that came out April the 27th in the Costa Rica News. They have a geology section, and there's a lot of geological study going on in Central America right now. And here's the article. "If it seems like earthquakes and erupting volcanoes are happening more frequently, that's because they are. Looking at global magnitude 6, M6, or greater from 1980 to 1989, there was an average of 108.5 earthquakes per year. From 2000 to 2009, the planet averaged 160.9 earthquakes per year. That's a 38.9% increase of M6 plus earthquakes in recent years. Unrest also seems to be growing among the world's supervolcanoes. Almost all of the world's active supervolcanic systems are now exhibiting some signs of inflation and early indication that pressure is building in these volcanic systems. And so I did a check on this yesterday, and I went through some different geological sites and websites and everything, and studied these things, find out what's going on. Right now, there are 162, it's never happened this way before, as far as we know, 162 active volcanoes in the world. And it's just this pressure is mounting and is growing. And earthquakes and volcanoes, go hand in hand. And so this is just growing. So Joel 2, 10 and 11 says this, "Before them the earth shakes, the heavens tremble, the sun and moon are darkened, and the stars no longer shine. The Lord thunders at the head of his army, his forces are beyond number, and mighty is the army that obeys his command. The day of the Lord is great, it is dreadful, who can endure it?" I have more, but we'll wait till next Sunday. Let's close with prayer.
On behalf of Dan Hurst and the Open Class, we want to thank you for watching. We hope it was a blessing.